Hi everyone, welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and tonight I am delighted to welcome you to a very special event, a first for Green Apple. We're welcoming Andrew Keene for a recording of his Lit Hub podcast, Keene On, and Andrew is joined by When We Walk By author Kevin F. Adler. Let's give a hand for both of them. Thank you so kindly. We're really lucky to count these writers and thinkers among our neighbors here in the Bay Area. Andrew puts out a daily podcast uplifting important books, which is a tireless job. And Kevin's book is particularly pertinent to us here in San Francisco, as we have a very large population of unhoused neighbors, and their struggle sometimes feels bigger than we as individuals might be able to have the capacity for, or really know what to do. So thank you both for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to hearing you, and I'm very grateful to have you here. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for joining us both in person and online. Hello, online audience. I appreciate you. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We are on unceded Ramaytush land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action by donating either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. Now, I have very brief business before I will let these two take over. Now is a good time to silence your phones if you have not already. I would say picture taking is encouraged, but we can leave that up to our authors as well.
Can we
if they
start
have a
with a
preference.
picture?
Sure, go for it.
Is that all right?
Yes.
Andrew, here we go. Are you ready? You don't have a book to hold up? Oh, you're so good. At the end, we'll have a whole book there.
Yes.
Perfect. Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Excellent. Good job, everybody.
Yeah.
Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have our season's coming to a close, but we have a really great 2024 ahead of us, and it's been a really great year thus far, and I hope to see you in the new one. The restroom is behind me. It is not available during the event for obvious reasons, but it is available after the event, so if you have any questions on how to get there, I will gladly tell you. And we have books from both of our authors available at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've definitely heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, thank you so kindly. We always appreciate it. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Andrew, who will then tell us a little bit about Kevin before we jump into this evening's program. A little bit about Keene On as a show, if you are unfamiliar with it. Keene On features conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers right now on economics, politics, business, etc. And Andrew himself has written 5 books, including the best-selling Cult of the Amateur, The Internet is Not the Answer, and How to Fix the Future. He directed and wrote the 2020 movie How to Fix Democracy, and is the host of Keene On, which we are here for right now. Please welcome Andrew Keene.
Thank you, Carv, very much for your generosity in hosting this. And it's I wouldn't say one of my favorite bookstores, it's my favorite bookstore in the Bay Area. So I strongly encourage everyone. I've forgotten actually that I wrote books, but it's nice that Carl reminded me that Kevin's book is new and relevant, and I hope you will all buy a book, and I'm sure Kevin will sign it afterwards. Kevin Adler is an activist, a thinker, a man who's dedicated a lot of his life to the huge question in the Bay Area of homelessness. It's a political, cultural, economic question that we all know we're against the idea of homelessness, but none of us seem to be able to figure it out. I think Kevin has done more thinking on this issue than almost anyone, and he has some very concrete answers, some critiques of how some people deal with it. His analysis is cultural, political, economic, and above all else, moral. And the way we're going to do this is he's going to talk for 8 to 10 minutes, introduce the book and his ideas. We'll have a brief conversation for 20, 25 minutes, and then we hope we'll have lots of questions from the floor. I'm sure most of you have strong opinions, feelings, questions about the issue of homelessness. So I hope we can make this into an interesting and valuable conversation. So, Kevin, over to you.
All right. Great to be with all of you. Thank you all. Did anyone go to the wrong book location? Laura did. Let's give it up for Laura. She's still here, and she went to the other location. That's commendable. My name's Kevin Adler. I have the privilege of being the founder and CEO of Miracle Messages. We're a nonprofit organization that helps people experiencing homelessness rebuild their social support systems and their financial security. We do that through family reunification services, a phone buddy program with volunteers, which, as a little plug, we right now have a waiting list of unhoused neighbors waiting for volunteers, one-to-one, 20, 30-minute phone calls, text messages every week. I'll share more throughout the program on how you can volunteer. And we also created what turned out to be the first basic income pilot for individuals experiencing homelessness in the United States. Happy to share more results on how that pilot went. But, to begin with, maybe just kind of what brought me to this work. How did I end up on a stage talking about homelessness? I have no lived experience of homelessness, thank God. 10 years ago, I didn't think about the issue more than, what I saw on social media, news feeds. But I had an uncle who was homeless, who experienced homelessness for 30 years. He lived on the streets of Santa Cruz. And after Uncle Mark passed away, I realized that everyone I'm walking by, that's someone's Uncle Mark. That's someone's son or daughter. That's someone's brother or sister. And I realized that in my own heart, I didn't see those individuals that I passed by on the streets in San Francisco as people to be loved, like my uncle. I saw them as problems to be solved. And fundamentally, the last 10 years in doing this work has been a journey of going from seeing homelessness and people experiencing homelessness as problems to be solved to people to be loved. And my hope is, by sharing a little bit about our work at Miracle Messages and the book that I've written, it's not just a flowery, kumbaya kind of thing. It's getting to know individuals at a person-by-person level, understanding what challenges they face to housing, if there's resistances that they may have to receiving services, what are those? And then walking a journey together in a very bottom-up, person-to-person way that has, proven to be effective nationwide. And I think we have some results at my nonprofit to share. A little bit more background. After my uncle passed away, started thinking about the issue of homelessness a bit differently. And, in a desire to try to get closer to my unhoused neighbors, I've always been interested in using technology to help kind of reveal our shared humanity. It almost sounds a little antiquated now, but 10 years ago and even today, how can we use the storytelling tools that we have access to, smartphones, social media, to maybe share how we have more in common than divides us. So long story short, I spent a year with 24 individuals experiencing homelessness who volunteered to wear GoPro cameras around their chests and narrate their experience of what life is like on the streets. And I got dozens and dozens of hours of footage back from 24 individuals who wear it for an hour or two at a time. And I watched every minute of that footage, and it was heartbreaking. It was pretty consistently, you'd see people scorned, pitied, looked down upon, but most of the time just totally ignored. And in one of the clips, I heard something that changed my life and started me on this trajectory. An individual said, I never realized I was homeless when I lost my housing, only when I lost my family and friends. I never realized I was homeless when I lost my housing, only when I lost my family and friends. And that it kind of made sense to me at a very intuitive level, but I hadn't heard any homeless service providers articulate anything like that. So not knowing what I didn't know, I just took a walk down Market Street, went up to everyone I saw who was visibly homeless, and asked a very simple question, which was, do you have any family or friends you'd like to reconnect to? And it just so turned out that the first person I met was a man named Jeffrey. He said he hadn't seen his family in 22 years. I sat down with him. I invited him to record a short message to his family. He said he'd like to record a video to his niece, his nephew, his sister, his dad. Recorded a video, go home that night. For a few days, I didn't do anything with the video because I didn't know who he was. I didn't want to make, cause a problem. But a few days go by, finally get on social media, on Facebook, and I did a search and found a Facebook group connected to his hometown. So I posted the video there with a short note, and within 1 hour, the video goes viral, makes the local news that night as the leading story, and classmates start commenting, hey, I went to high school with Jeffrey, I work in construction, does he need a job? I work at the congressman's office, does he need health care? In the first 20 minutes of the post, his sister got tagged. We got on the phone the next day, and she tells me that Jeffrey had been a missing person for 12 years. And it's broad daylight downtown San Francisco a few days before Christmas, 2014. So that's when I started doing what became Miracle Messages full time, because I knew Jeffrey wasn't the only one and this shouldn't be happening. Fast forward to today, it's not just me wandering the streets with GoPros and recording videos. We now have a team, including Nellie, who's one of our Miracle Messages team members. Let's give it up for Nellie. We have a group of 10 of us on the team that we're dedicated to this idea that our unhoused neighbors are people to be loved, not problems to solve. The 3 programs we offer, there's the family reunification services. So first, messages will come in, people record message, a video, audio message, text message, but it could also be online form, paper form. We have a hotline phone number. You'll remember this for the rest of your life. You ready? 1-800-MISS-YOU. 1-800-MISSYOU. So a person who wants to reconnect to a family member, friend, loved one, calls 1-800-MISS-YOU, or a volunteer, caseworker, social worker on their behalf, and it reaches one of our staff members or a volunteer. We take down some information, and we start with our community of volunteer digital detectives. Second plug, anyone wants to volunteer. Use your digital sleuthing skills for good. Does anyone have teenage son or daughter here? No, kids? Yeah, those are the folks who have done the most internet research. Like, wait, who are you going out with? It's Friday night? You know what I mean? We need to put your skills to good use, right? So we have our digital detectives, and cumulatively, we've now, through those efforts, reconnected over 800 individuals experiencing homelessness with their loved ones. The average time disconnected, somewhere between 10 to 15 years. And 80% of the reunions tend to lead to a positive outcome, and about 15% have led to stable housing or living with family again. And just as a connection point, in San Francisco, between 2015 and 2019, 60% of successful shelter exits in San Francisco, meaning someone went from a shelter to housing, were as a result of reunification. 60%. 30% for permanent supportive housing, 10% for transitional housing, 60% for some form of reunification. But you might be asking, well, that's fine and good for some people, but many of our unhoused neighbors' family might be part of the problem, not part of the solution. Or bridges have been burned. Maybe there's no support. Maybe a family doesn't have any resources to offer. What do you do then? And that's where we've launched our second program, which is a Phone Buddy program, where we have volunteers around the country, one-to-one phone calls, text messages, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a week. And that program has been, really, just the stories that have emerged from that are just incredibly, beautiful, just true relationships. And then finally, when you have the relationships, we've realized that, individuals they trust each other, but it's very hard to be on equal footing if a person doesn't know what they're going to eat that night, or they don't know how they're going to get to work on Monday and, put gas in their car. And so our volunteers asked us in our Phone Buddy program, they said, we'd like to do some kind of financial giving? Can we raise some money? So we ended up raising $50,000 initially and selected 14 individuals in our Phone Buddy program, gave each of them $500 a month for 6 months, no questions asked, no strings attached. And 6 months later, 2/3 of those individuals were able to secure stable housing. They used the money better than I could have used it for them. And having seen that, and we're now doing a expanded version of that, we're doing a $2.1 million randomized controlled trial with Google.org and USC, looking at the impacts of cash transfers and social support. So to bring it to the book, and I want to make sure I leave time for the conversation and then, of course, your questions. So having seen and heard story after story for the last 10 years, when you share a story individually, it's a human interest story. It's powerful, it's heartfelt, but it kind of comes and goes. Starting to hear the through lines between these stories, the patterns, why someone who, like Elizabeth, had never experienced a day of homelessness in her life, and then at the age in her 50s, got the diagnosis from her doctor that she had colon cancer, had been working for years as a school teacher in Redwood City, could no longer work because of the chemotherapy, ended up losing her apartment, losing her job, and ending up in a shelter for the first time in her adult life. And seeing her get off the streets and get housed with a basic income and with a Phone Buddy, it made me realize that this isn't a silver bullet, right? If you're coming tonight to listen to what's the one thing we need to do to end homelessness, I don't have that for you. But what I do have is examples of lives transformed, a sense of hope, stories that I've seen that have made me more hopeful on this issue than I was, a decade ago when I started this work. And this recognition that there's this part of homelessness that we don't talk about that's just as problematic as the broken systems. So we talk about affordable housing, talk about that, criminal justice system, income inequality, foster care system where 1 out of every 3 young people who age out of foster care will experience homelessness by the time they're 26 years old. And that goes up to 60% for African American young people. So we can talk system by system, and there's some serious work to do, and that's all in the book. But the first section of the book isn't on broken systems, it's on breakdowns and failures in our shared humanity, where if we see people as them as opposed to us, when we think of our unhoused neighbors not as neighbors, but as the homeless, and we would never look at ourselves as the housed, and yet we look at our unhoused neighbors from Elizabeth to Jeffrey to folks who we may see on the streets every day and see have severe substance abuse issues, mental health issues, everyone's grouped together into the homeless. It makes it very hard to distinguish what each person needs, what barriers they face, what challenges they face. So a big argument in the book is we have to look in the mirror and think about how we can be in relationship with our unhoused neighbors and get past the stigma, the shame, the otherizing, the paternalism that happens. But you're all here tonight, so I know that you're already halfway there. And it's a book that I think at the end of the day is meant to be hopeful. It's not a book that's doom and gloom and feel judged, because the truth is this is an issue that's incredibly hard. And maybe the last thing I'll share just in closing. So neuroscientists at Princeton and Duke have found that the part of our brain that activates when we see a person compared to an inanimate object, it's called the medial prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain has been found not to respond when we see someone that we perceive to be in an extreme outgroup in our society, including people experiencing homelessness. And the implications of that. So a few years ago, the New York City Rescue Mission did an experiment where they had individuals dress up to look homeless as unsuspecting members of their very own families walked by. And in each instance, not a single person recognized their own mom or dad, son or daughter, brother or sister, as they were dressed to look homeless on the streets. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and that's okay. It's just recognizing what it is that we have to do and then getting to it. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm excited to be in the conversation.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction. I had one broad question, some concrete ones, and I think we should throw it out to the audience because there's so much to digest and think about. The way you present it, Kevin, it sounds to me as if for you, homelessness is a kind of exile. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's pretty perceptive. My background research prior to this was around natural disasters. I looked at how floods, earthquakes, fires can either bring people together or tear people apart. And over the years, it's a great question, Andrew, because I've come to look at homelessness at some level as a highly invisible, highly unnatural disaster, where the folks that we see are much closer to refugees of a flood, earthquake, fire, except instead of calling it a flood, earthquake, or fire, it's a job loss, it's a death in the family, it's being denied housing option after housing option because you have a felony on your record or some kind of mark that makes it so landlords don't rent to you. And it's affecting millions and millions of people in this country, and yet we look at it in the lens of individual responsibility. What did they do wrong? What's wrong with them? And yet right now in this country, 1 out of every 2 Americans is a paycheck away from not being able to pay rent. And 47% of people say they don't know where they get $400 for an unexpected emergency. So you almost have to wonder, why aren't tens of millions of people homeless? And what we're finding is family, friends, community, church, synagogue, mosque, informal economies making up the difference. So if you don't have that, or you've lost that, or the family and friends, social supports can't help with doubling up, tripling up, a little bit of cash payment, you can be in real trouble. And then the experience of homelessness itself is very isolating, otherizing. So yeah, I think it is a type of exile.
And then in a sense, now we want to get to the concrete numbers, but in a sense you talk about tens of millions. There are, in one sense, tens of millions of homeless people who have chosen, for one reason or other, to leave their home and come somewhere else. Immigrants or wannabe immigrants. Homelessness is already a big enough subject, but are there conceptual bridges, links, connections between immigration and homelessness, people who have no home or have chosen to leave their home and go somewhere else, and of course the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment and politics. I think over the weekend, anti-immigrant politician got the biggest vote in the Netherlands of all places. We know all about Trump and his comments about immigrants. So is there a connection, Kevin, between our distaste, if you like, for immigrants, legal or otherwise, and our unwillingness to look them in the eye and acknowledge them, and our unwillingness to look homeless people in the eye and acknowledge them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a fear of the other, for sure. I think there's a tendency in society after society to scapegoat, to look at a group as the embodiment of all that ails society. And we have a massive addiction issue in this country that's affecting housed and unhoused people alike. And it's totally unacceptable to be having, open air drug markets and things that are frankly putting our unhoused neighbors at the biggest risk of all. But it's conflating issues, and it's creating this monolith of the homeless, and let's fix that and then all our problems will go away. So I do think, there's a kind of fear of the other. But, I think it's important at this point in the conversation on this to talk about, I think in San Francisco, about 70% of people who are experiencing homelessness in San Francisco were once housed in San Francisco. are from San Francisco, have been here for years. If you look at California, those numbers go up to about 90%. 90% of the people who are unhoused in California were housed in California. And I also think, you bring up this question of like choice. I think it's really important to examine the idea of choice and agency here, because I think there is a narrative around making, not that we're talking about that tonight, or that your question's that, but there's this narrative around, is someone choosing to be homeless, right? Is it a lifestyle? And that almost never is the case, because it's not a lifestyle, it's a death sentence. The life expectancy on the streets is 30 years less than if you were housed. The average age is about 50. That's when my uncle passed away. That's when a lot of my unhoused friends have passed away doing this work for a decade. But a young person who's escaping an unsafe home environment, are they making a choice to be out of that home environment? Well, yes, but what are the options? A person who has a cancer diagnosis, they didn't choose to have cancer, they choose to get treatment, they end up in a shelter, and if you go person by person, the idea of choice around homelessness is pretty illusory. But I do think there's a kind of, if we get to see that for what it is, it does shatter this notion of, well, they are us, and therefore it shouldn't be a criminal matter, it should really be a community matter. So.
There's another book on all this which takes a very different position from yours, from another local writer. It's called San Francisco, and it suggests, and I'm sure some of you at least are familiar with the argument, that the problem with homelessness in towns like San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, Los Angeles, is progressive politics. And that in this book he suggests that the core issues around homelessness are drugs and mental illness. People, for better or worse, choose, or many homeless people choose to be homeless. How would you address that argument? I know that you don't reject it entirely. I don't think you're in his camp. But is there any truth to that? Is there some responsibility in the armies, it seems, of homeless people in San Francisco with progressive politicians?
I think there's blame that's well-deserved in the progressive side. I think there's also a similar level of blame that could be looked at on a more conservative side. In the book I talk about two types of paternalism: progressive paternalism and punitive paternalism. So the punitive paternalism, which is more associated maybe with like kind of what we consider, conservative circles, it's law and order, you did wrong, you pay the price, right? Accountability, responsibility, some form of retributive justice. And the progressive paternalism has much more to do with the savior complex, a type of self-righteousness, right? Assuming we know better than what they want and need. An example of that where I exemplified progressive paternalism. One of my friends on the street, his name was Ronnie Goodman. He was a marathon runner. Has anyone heard of Ronnie in here? Yeah, a few folks. I see a few head nods. Incredible artist, incredible runner, raised money for charity while being on the streets. And I was having a conversation 8 or 9 years ago with Ronnie, and asked him, Ronnie, do you have, what's your prospects for getting housed? And, he said, well, I have housing available to me if I want it. And I was like, okay, well, Ronnie, you're currently living in a tent. Would you be interested in that housing? Like, what can I do to help? And he kind of looked at me really patiently, and just kind of said, well, Kevin, that housing that's available to me, it's in a part of the city and in a building where drugs are present 24/7. And I have a history of addiction. If I go into that housing unit, I am going to relapse and die. And so I'm waiting a few years to be eligible for senior housing. And then I'm going to try to take up the senior housing. And that's my plan. And I went from having this incredible judgment of Ronnie and seeing him and, oh, you have housing, you're choosing, it's a lifestyle, it's making a choice, to saying, well, that's a pretty logical, thoughtful, common sense thing. I that makes sense to me. So I think when we talk about, I'm familiar with the book you're talking about. There is this meta narrative about, Sodom and Gomorrah and doom and gloom and individuals making horrible choices. But I think the merit, to your point, Andrew, that it's not, I'm not, wanting to dismiss it outright, is I think we have this kind of double speak and double think around homelessness in this city, right? Like, it's like, hey, y'all, the emperor has no clothes. Things are fine. They're not fine. They are not fine. Look at the community out here tonight. Like, you wouldn't be here if it was like, well, there's that one homeless guy down at the Trader Joe's and that's it. What's there to talk about? Like, it is not fine. And for every one person that the city gets off the streets, there's 3 to 4 people who get on the streets. There's it's at the source a prevention issue that's going on as well. And I also think there's a role that's limited that needs to be considered for involuntary holds and involuntary treatment. And I know that may not be popular in some settings, but I think if we look at the deinstitutionalization, we don't want to go back to one flew over the cuckoo's nest, right? That's not where we want to be. But we've swung way to the other side of the spectrum to the point that we have this kind of permissive mindset that just let people live and die where they are. The people who have woken me up to the need to have some limited role of hospitalizations, treatment, support are the family members of individuals, because they care the most about the person's well-being. The asterisk, though, on that, because I don't want that to just be, okay, well, that's the solution. Well, how do you make that assessment? Has the person are they a threat to themselves or to others? Have every other option been tried? And we already have 5150s. We already have limited holds. The question is, well, what do you do next? You can't hold the person indefinitely. And that's where in the book we talk about the importance of investing in recovery centers, treatment, housing. We're spending tens of thousands of dollars per person per year maintaining people on the streets. We're already spending money on homelessness that we shouldn't really be spending, or at least should be reallocating. And so I do think investing in individuals and investing in the kinds of supports that we all need as humans is a better way to go. So.
I have one more question, then we'll open it up. And I didn't ask you this when you were on the show on Friday. I wanted to, I forgot, so I'm going to want to do it now. I wonder if, when we think this thing through, you seem to be suggesting that we need to, if not love the homeless, turn it into a human issue. But I wonder whether there's another element here. Some of you may be familiar with the political ideas of John Rawls. We've done some shows on Rawlsian political philosophy on Keen On. Rawls suggests that we should operate in society with a veil of ignorance, in the sense that we're never quite sure what's going to happen to us. We might turn out to be successful, we might turn out to be wealthy, but we also might turn out to be homeless. So I wonder whether, rather than thinking about loving the homeless, which I'm not suggesting we shouldn't, whether another way of thinking about this is the Rawlsian notion that we could all imagine ourselves as homeless. Mm-hmm. So there should be, if you like, an element of selfishness here. That given that any of us, and especially in America, without a social safety net, where, as you say, the teacher in Redwood City who had a full-time job and then had the bad luck to get very sick and turned out to be homeless, it can happen to any of us. Is that how we should be thinking about this politically, alongside the ideal of loving the homeless?
And bringing me back to my political theory days. I appreciate that. He speaks, I think, a lot about luck and optionality.
Yeah,
right?
the idea that we can't determine the American dream, of course, quote unquote, presumes that we control our luck. Mm-hmm. But of course we don't.
So there's a great quote in the book, and I'm not quoting myself saying it's someone else said it, right? I found a great quote, I put it in the book. I'm not like, this book's fabulous, you guys should all check it out. Though, remember the selfie we took at the beginning, what happened? There was a lot of stick figures and fingers. So there's a great quote in the book, and it's from someone who I don't always quote in good company, and it's former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he has this terrific quote that he was giving at a commencement address a few years ago, and he said, "You can call me Arnold, you can call me Schwartzy, you can call me the Terminator, but whatever you call me, you cannot call me a self-made man." He said, every bit of success I've had in my life has been because I've had a mentor, coach. I was an immigrant. I was nobody. Someone looked after me. I stayed with a friend from the gym. I doubled up. I tripled up. Every single thing I've had in this country is not because of me being a self-made man. It's because someone else believed in me. And it gave me an opportunity, especially when I needed it. And I think even if we think about a time in our lives that we could have gone a different way, or maybe we did for a while. I have friends who reach out to me all the time who, say, "Hey, don't tell anyone I'm a C-suite executive. They're doing well. They're entrepreneurs. They've sold companies. They're like, I too experienced homelessness, but don't tell anyone. Because it's still so embarrassing, stigmatized. My mom was homeless. My brother, between jobs after college, the thing didn't work out." That's the conversation we should be having. And, I take a page from the Governator. He says, I'm not a self-made man, then I tend to believe that there's very few self-made men and women in this country. So I do think, and in the book there's a lot on this idea of deservedness. And if we have individual notions of success and failure, we will, it will blind us to, I think, the life that our unhoused neighbors have gone through and lived to get to where they're at. And frankly, it obfuscates the role that other people have played in our own lives to get to where we're at.
I'm sure lots of you have questions, and I know Kevin was eager to also learn a little bit about why you're here and what brought you here. So for people who have questions, maybe they could briefly introduce themselves, explain what their interest is in this subject. So we've got quite a lot of time left, and I'm sure many people have strong opinions, questions, comments on what Kevin has already said. So let me throw it out to you. Don't be shy. This is San Francisco. San Francisco. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Jim, and I'm on the board of an organization known colloquially as DISH, Delivering Innovations in Supportive Housing. And there are dozens of supportive housing entities in San Francisco, like DISH, Fiscal Community Services, that are housing hundreds, thousands of people at the moment. And they do sometimes, residents do sometimes connect with families and move out to live with families. And I'm wondering if you have any systematic way of getting in touch with the supportive housing network and offering to provide your connection services through those entities to their residents.
Yeah, I would love to connect. Jim, right? Yeah, we partner with quite a few organizations in San Francisco. We haven't connected with DISH, I don't believe yet. Our Director of Strategic Partnerships, Nellie, is right there. We have worked with ECS before, YWAM. Gubio Project, yes, one of my favorite organizations. And I appreciate Jim also bringing up the role of affordable housing. I mean, there's a great book that just came out called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And I generally agree, right? Homelessness is a housing problem. And because we haven't built enough housing, and because of the headwinds, it's become much more than a housing problem. Because there are both other systems that lead to homelessness, and then the experience of homelessness is horrible for your health, mental health, behavioral health, physical health, isolating, disconnecting, lots of other issues. So homelessness is a housing issue, and it's also a health issue. It's also a justice issue. It's also a income inequality issue. So it's critical, the work that I know DISH, a great organization, and would love to partner. But we do work with organizations like yours.
Great, thank you.
So thanks, Jim. Thanks for coming. There's over 3,000 counties in the United States, and there's 0 of those counties can a person who's working full-time at minimum wages afford a 2-bedroom apartment based on the median income, or median cost. And in less than 1% of those counties can that same person working full-time at a minimum wage job afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So fundamentally, when you have very expensive markets and people not earning enough wages, you're going to have issues like homelessness. So,
My name is Alex. So part of what brings me here is I volunteer with UCSF doctors and nurse practitioners in the Tenderloin, where they give out COVID vaccines and flu vaccines to the population there. And I can only speak from my anecdotal evidence, but it seems that a lot of this problem is also, and you suggested and talk about it too, with substance abuse.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if you could expand on some more statistics. It seems like it's at this point all sort of enmeshed in one giant knot, and we need to sort of untangle it systemically. And is it as knotted as it seems to us? Do the statistics say otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the exact stat I'd have to pull in the book, but to give you off the top of my head, the HUD, by the HUD definition of homelessness, Department of Housing, Urban Development, it's somewhere around 582,000 people, 600,000 people experience homelessness on any given night. So that's based on point in time count. I believe that about 30% of that total of the 582,000 has some kind of substance abuse issue or mental health issue. I believe it's around 30%. And I'll have to just double check. I'm going to pull that up. But I think what sometimes gets missed in the conversation is the visible manifestation of homelessness, which is within usually that 30%, and I'll double check the numbers. That is a very visible, high needs, but minority of the people experiencing homelessness in the United States. Most of homelessness we're not seeing. Folks are wanting to do everything they possibly can to not appear as someone experiencing homelessness. And if we use the Department of Education's definition, which is what we use in the book, that includes people who are doubled up and tripled up. That includes the invisible homeless, oftentimes children and women with children, and often families. And based on those numbers, we estimate that it's closer to 6 million people over the course of the year that experience homelessness. So I do think it's critically important to not, you cannot have a conversation like what we're having about trying to build our humanity and then talk about homelessness as a one-size-fits-all group. But I can double check that, or if someone wants to fact check me of my own book, you could do that. But it's a great question. And, I think I'm actually really glad that a lot of our conversation tonight has been around who are the homeless, what backgrounds do they have, what's the experiences, because I think that gets often lost in the discourse. It's just seen as kind of, I want to say lowest common denominator, but folks who have the highest acuity, comorbidities, on the streets, unsheltered individuals, whereas there's other types of homelessness that, also are important to talk about. Oh, yes.
My name's Tiffany. I'm on the board of Saver Life, which is actually tackling the savings crisis in America.
Oh, there you go. What's it called?
Saver Life?
Saver, not saber, like the sword.
Like save.
So Saver.
So building a culture of saving.
So the financial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in tech and a nonprofit. But my question is actually personal. So I grew up in the sort of evangelical church and was part of the social justice movement. And in that, I saw this role of the church as a place that can reach out to the unhoused. At the same time, I have family members who are Christian but are very conservative Republicans. And so the tension I feel is the role of caring for the unhoused, is it a private or is it a public thing? Do you have a framework for thinking about the role of government versus private individuals versus other institutions?
Oh, okay. You need to have her on your podcast.
Good question.
Excellent question. If I can, I'll start your very good philosophical and you asked a question on personal or public. I'd like to start from a personal level. So I wasn't raised religious. I think there was a reverence for something bigger than ourselves and our family. When I was 12, I felt like something was missing in my life, and besides puberty, which was also missing. It's come though. But I felt like something was missing, and I asked my family if we could start going to local churches. And through that process, we all got baptized. My dad, my brother, and I. My mom had been raised Episcopalian, baptized as a baby. And so I went to church pretty actively every Sunday growing up. I'm Christian. I'm still, a person of faith. But I've had many falling outs with the organized church. And I've always felt that it wasn't so much me leaving an individual church body, it was the church leaving what I feel are the values of the Bible, or at least the red letter part that I tend to focus on. So without getting kind of too personal or esoteric here, I've found sometimes individual Christians and fellow, individuals of faith of all backgrounds, whether Jewish, Tikkun alum is a major facet. We have individuals who are Muslim, who are very active in our volunteer program. We have an individual in the Middle East, in Bahrain, who is a friend to a young person in LA. They almost instinctively get this work as an embodiment of the values. I think what sometimes happens, though, is each individual church has its own kind of pet project on how they look at homelessness. And there tends to be in some of the groups that I've worked with, more of a desire to, have some other facet to the outreach rather than just being with the person. So, who ministers the most to me are our neighbors experiencing homelessness. Because what we do is we offer our services, we show love, we tell them, that you matter. And if they want to reconnect to a loved one, we do that. If they want a friend, we do that. If, they're eligible for a basic income, we do that. And then they talk about how God's working in their life. And, I take a page from, I believe, Dorothy Day, great Catholic worker, reformer, who was asked once, well, hey, you're Catholic, but you are, teaching kids who aren't Catholic. Like, what's wrong with you? And she said, well, I don't teach them because they're Catholic. I teach them because I'm Catholic. And so, I think we at Miracle Messages nonprofit, we have folks of all backgrounds, beliefs, people who have no faith backgrounds. And, I believe in my personal faith that God will work through those hands, how he sees fit. So.
And what about the piece of the question, the public responsibility?
Yeah, thank you. I think what I want to say on this is that I think we have such a desire as humans to connect with each other. And every problem, if we go through how the world is right now, it feels almost insurmountable. What do you do? I mean, whether you're a person of faith or not, you know, prayer and thoughts rarely feel like a sufficient amount to offer. You share stuff on social media, you like stuff, you talk about it, you come to events like this wanting to help, and often we're not asked to do much more than that. We're kind of asked to just be complacent. Having studied social capital and looked at how, after an event, looking at how people came together, relatively speaking, not all groups were included, but after, in World War II was considered a kind of high point of connectedness in this country and public responsibility, people looking out for each other. And social capital, as measured by trust, civic engagement, sense of togetherness, has been on the decline since about the late 1960s, according to Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone. And there wasn't really much explanation as to why. And, I, in my previous research, found that the experience, feeling some kind of shared experience with people is critically important, where you're gone through something together and you can kind of relate. So I think homelessness right now doesn't have that framework attached to it. It's seen as an individual failing. It's seen, well, what did they do wrong? What mistakes have they made? It's almost the fact that we give out money, perhaps at a stoplight, and then are wondering, well, how are they going to use it? Which 95% plus is used on food, for what it's worth. That almost begs the question, well, why is it our business to ask? Should that affect our giving? Right? You don't want to do more harm than good. I think there's a nuanced conversation. I don't want to be, but yeah, and I think until we see the experiences our neighbors experience, who are experiencing homelessness, are going through as very familiar to our own experiences, we'll continue to see it in this individualized way. And I do think that moving to what you're calling for, of a more public recognition and accountability to this issue of homelessness, whether it's through faith institutions, civic groups, service clubs, or just kind of everyday people coming together and saying enough is enough, this is ridiculous, like we should not have this crisis in the wealthiest nation that's ever existed. I think that's critical to what we're critical to solving homelessness. So,
this lady.
I work as an arbiter in unemployment insurance, and it I think is often misunderstood. People tend to think of people who need unemployment insurance as somehow failing or not living up to some standard, much like homelessness. And the program was started in the 1930s. Francis Perkins, Roosevelt. Why not for the individual, but for the country? Because what happened with the Depression was that people were laid off en masse and they could no longer consume, and our consumer economy kept spiraling down. So when we think about our support systems not as individually helping the poor person who needs it, which it does, but in a larger term, the rest of us, and we can get the idea that we're in this together, not only economically, but climatologically. I mean, the species won't survive unless we see ourselves as working together. And I too started out as an evangelical Christian many decades ago and understand that and believe it, and fundamentally it shaped my life. But I think it's practical to think of these things in the larger scope of helping ourselves as a mass, as a species.
Yes, thank you. What was your name?
Julia.
Julia. Wonderful comment. Can I read a very short passage? Is that okay, Julia? You've invoked it. If you said no, I would have my feelings hurt. Nah, I've heard enough. We're done. Where's the bathroom? Get these guys off the stage. So, Julia, your remarks really touched me, and I wanted to read something from the last chapter of the book that I think ties some of what you just shared so poignantly and eloquently with I think what I've tried to convey tonight. And I felt myself even getting kind of teary-eyed as you're speaking, in part because of where we are in this bookstore, because we're across from Golden Gate Park. So in the early morning hours of Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck along the San Andreas Fault in Northern California, with the epicenter just 2 miles off the coast of San Francisco. The massive quake caused a conflagration that destroyed some 28,000 buildings in San Francisco, leveling more than 500 blocks in the city center. More than 3,000 people died, and about 80% of the city was destroyed. In the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake and fire, some 250,000 residents in San Francisco were displaced, establishing makeshift camps in park areas and in burnt-out ruins of buildings. For a short period of time, more than half of the city's 400,000 residents experienced homelessness. In response, the city did not pass anti-camping ordinances. Law enforcement was not mobilized to raise tents and confiscate belongings. Local residents whose homes withstood the brunt of the disaster did not join together to form anti-survivor, not in my backyard protests. Instead, city officials and local residents rallied together to help. As winter approached, the city built 5,300 small wooden cottages for those still in need of housing, while the Army housed 20,000 refugees in military-style tent camps. Camps formed playgroups for kids and dining halls for individuals and families, which became the centers for social life. Tenants paid $2 a month toward the $50 price of their earthquake cottage. Many assembled in Golden Gate Park. After paying off their new home, the owners were required to move their cottages out of the camp, leaving earthquake cottages scattered throughout San Francisco, in an early example of scattered site housing. In June 1908, just 2 years after one of the most devastating disasters in American history, the last camp closed. 250,000 unhoused survivors had been housed. We've done this before. And this as a last part, according to the historical accounts of many survivors, the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake and fire was a time of civic renewal and mutuality in San Francisco, as evidenced by the creation of emergency rezoning ordinances, outdoor soup kitchens, refugee camps and earthquake cottages as affordable housing, and emergency assistance and goodwill from countless volunteers. Overwhelmingly, survivors were embraced, not ostracized. Or to put it another way, survivors were able to discover a social home in addition to physical housing. And we can go on from there, but I'll leave it at that. But this is our lineage, right?
I think we've got time for a couple more brief questions. Sure, this gentleman here.
What I'm enjoying about tonight is listening to data and analysis framing the problem, but your heart is speaking through it all, and I'm feeling hopeful. It's one of the first conversations that I feel like is intellectually stirring, but I'm also feeling hopeful from the heart. MLK had that vision of a beloved community to confront the inequality of racism in the 60s. to speak from that same heart, what's your vision if you could have it on this issue? Because it sounds like we're not just solving a problem, but we're learning about all of ourselves as we respond to the other. What's your vision? What do you want? Or what would you picture if we could really step into what's beating in your heart?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question.
Yeah.
So Brian Stevenson is a favorite thinker of mine. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And he talks about this concept of getting proximate. Getting proximate. I agree, and I actually think we have to get further than proximate. You have to be relational. You have to get to a point where you know someone by name as a friend, as a family member who's going through the thing, as a neighbor. Otherwise, how can you fully understand? I mean, you never can fully understand, but you can get proximate, you can get closer, you can get relational. And you mentioned, in the context of MLK, and I think the civil rights movement and racial justice. And as an example, a bit aside from homelessness, but I think the broader themes that you're getting at. So I managed to find love amid the pandemic. Woohoo! I mean, if my dad was in the audience, he would have been cheering. He's like, thank God. How long did it take you? Right? And my partner, Taja, is just, I could not have asked for a better partner. She's Black. She's Native American by ancestry. And in our first month or so of our relationship, during the pandemic, we're walking down the street, actually just a few blocks from here, near Golden Gate Park, and we're holding hands. And someone who was passing by yelled a racist remark at us. And it was directed mostly at her, but it was at me as well. We don't need to repeat it. And, first I instinctively just wanted to confront the person, get into it, and somehow chose not to and kept walking. And I later asked Taja, and she said, that was the right call. Like, we don't want to have a thing here. But I asked her afterwards, I kind of worked up the courage to ask her a question that had been on my mind since we started dating. And I said, I was kind of like beside myself that this had happened, talking about it. And then she said to me, well, something like that happens to me at least once a month. I was like, okay, so you're having a very different experience here than what I'm having, right? Okay, I want to know that experience more. I love you. I care about you. And so she told me that, and I was, again, just trying to understand. I said, I got to be honest. One of the biggest fears I have is that I'm going to say or do the wrong thing. And without missing a beat, she looked at me and she said, don't worry, you will. It's like, inevitably you're going to. Inevitably. Because how could you not? You don't understand. You haven't been through it. You're experiencing things in a very different lens. But the point isn't whether you will make a mistake, because you will. It's, do you then listen afterwards to what that made me feel like? Do we have a conversation? Do you talk down to me? Do you put my experiences in a box? Do you ask questions? Do you do your own research? Do you do your own learning? And I've realized over the last 3.5 years being with my partner that was an incredible gift she gave me. She didn't need to give that to me. But I've tried to use that mindset and framework on a lot of these issues of our time. We can't understand what's it like to go through an experience like homelessness. I can't, at least. Maybe some folks in the audience can because they've been there, too close than they'd like. But the only way we can get close enough and have any kind of credibility on it is we have to be able to raise our hand and say, not only do I care about the issue of homelessness, but I have a friend who's experiencing homelessness. I have a neighbor. I've taken the extra step to get to know someone who's going through that. And it doesn't mean you'll understand their experience, but you get closer and then perhaps then you're less likely to walk by because it's now part of you. It's part of your experience. It's someone you care about. So that's my hope. I think the beloved community is attainable, and it also can be short-lived and fleeting. But I don't know what else is better to strive for. And I also know that part of the work to do is a lot of learning, asking hard questions, probably stuff that we can't do on Twitter. I don't think we can do this on Twitter. I think we have to show up in person, look at each other, get to know each other again as neighbors.
Thank you.
One more question. This gentleman here in the green.
My grandmother worked for Dorothy Day. So,
Can I have your autograph? Amazing. Wow.
I've been listening to you, and I think that what you said tonight and the book that you've written and the talk you is, first of all, it seems like a profound invitation to individual acts of charity that are needed. And I was wondering whether the work you've done in terms of reunification and support is done by any, in San Francisco, at least where we live, by any city agency, or is it something that they really can't do? They don't. They've got a job that's lined out, and they've got reports, and they've got union rules. These are individual acts of charity. Have you discussed is there any agency in the city that does any of the type of work you're doing now? Have you tried to interest them in it? And if it's not, is it because they can't do it? You need to continue to proselytize.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
It's a good one to end on.
That's a great one to end on. I will be in conversation with Shireen McFadden, who's the head of the Department of Homelessness Supportive Housing, in January at the Mechanics Institute. So I may steal your question and talk with her. But if I'm going to answer it myself, there's elements of what we do that can be integrated into systems and are and have been. So San Francisco, there's this program that has now been replicated across the country called Homeward Bound. You're familiar with it? And Homeward Bound is essentially a kind of one-way bus ticket program. To differentiate it from our work, we look at Homeward Bound as a last step towards family reunification. You just need the bus fare. You just need a plane ticket, but you're already in touch. They love you. They want you. They're willing to bring you back. And our work is much more of a first step. Our conversations begin, how are you? How long have you lived in the area? Does your family live nearby? When was the last time you were in touch? Do you know their phone number? Oh, you don't. Do you have an address? Would you want to record a message? And then spending a lot of hours on people directories, search platforms, doing painstaking phone calls, outreach, writing letters. That work, I think, would be challenging for caseworkers to do, given their client load and given the need that we use social media. So in that sense, I think partnering with city makes sense. But I also think there's something fundamentally different about the kind of assessments that are done on homelessness in, assessing someone's eligibility for affordable housing, for instance. Perhaps asking about criminal history, substance abuses, how long the person's been experiencing homelessness. These are important questions to ask. I'm not trying to be dismissive, but it's a fundamentally different conversation to then say, well, who do you miss that you haven't reached out to because perhaps you're ashamed of what you're going through and you don't want to be a burden? Are you feeling lonely, isolated? What we talk about in the book is this idea of relational poverty as a form of poverty. Isolation, loneliness, disconnection, stigma, and shame that accompanies it. Assessing relational poverty, that takes a lot of trust and a lot of time. Right. It takes relationship. I don't think that could be done in a realistic way if you have only a couple minutes per person and you're just kind of going through the caseload. So we do try to work within systems as much as possible. We try to integrate. We have a lot of referral partners where every day we have partner organizations refer people to us through our hotline, online form, the hotline, the 1-800-MISS-YOU number. But I think it does require a partnership. I don't think a city or any, not just this city, but any government entity could do what we can do as neighbors. So.
I've been watching No One Left Car. Is that a world record?
Oh, he's standing up. He was like, but he's just stretching. Yeah. He's stretching. He's stretching.
Kevin
He's
did
stretching.
a wonderful job.
Yeah, I'm gonna sign some books, right? Is anyone getting a book? All right, I'm gonna sign your book.
And it's a difficult subject. I don't think any of us want to really talk about it, but you've made it compelling, relevant, essential. So I want to thank you so much for the book and for your work.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here, and we're going to hand the mic back. And we do have, just as a final plug, because Nellie will kill me if I don't make it, I wasn't joking about having more unhoused friends than we have volunteers. It's 20 minutes, 30 minutes a week, phone calls, text messages. If you're not comfortable giving out your personal phone number, we partner with Dialpad and Google Voice. So you can get an app on your phone where it's a phone number. You can make phone calls and text messages through the app. We have weekly trainings, support calls. We have a community of volunteers. And there's a call log. So if there's an issue that you don't know how to deal with and it's just overwhelming or the person needs a caseworker or a social worker, you just flag that in the call system. And then one of our staff members follows up and tries to get a caseworker on board. So that's called Miracle Friends, and you can sign up either with me, Nellie, or at miraclemessages.org. So, okay, that was did I cover the basis, Nellie?
Yeah, can I add something
Yes.
too? Is that allowed? I really like it. I know that it can be nerve-wracking because of course we want to be good humans, but if we have not experienced anything with somebody that is unhoused, it can be kind of nerve-wracking. So we even have things like conversation guides or like a list of questions to ask to get to know your friend. And so we really try to help our volunteers, and your role as a volunteer is to just be a good friend. Like, you are not solving their problems, you are just listening to them. And I think it is such an amazing way to get in touch with our community. So
Thanks, Nellie. Okay, I'm going to hand over the mic.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm just here to ask that we give one more hand to Kevin and Mary. Thank you all so much for being here. I so appreciate you, and our online audience. Hello, online. Thank you so kindly. Thank you for your engaged questions. Thank you for being in our bookstore. I am also here to let you know, to remind you that we have copies of books at the front register. You can find them there. I'm going to have Kevin at the back desk here to sign books. And if you need to know where to go, I'll gladly tell you. And if not, we will see you next time. Thank you so much.